All right, we're doing things a little bit differently with the live stream, so just because we kind of had to. So just bear with me because this may take me a minute to get this situated. Okay. Dad, I think the audio should be working too, but you can double check me on that. So we are picking up in our study of the book of 1 Kings. We're going to wrap up chapter 7 today and get into chapter 8 as well, where we are going to return to the Ark of the Covenant. Of course, we look at chapter 7. We've been talking about the construction of the temple. Chapter 7, a lot of it deals with the furnishing of the temple. Some of the things, whereas maybe the intricacy or the artistry of those who helped build the pillars that were within the temple. Just going back, what we kind of briefly covered last time. We talked about the construction of the temple. We saw last time that Solomon has a guy named Hiram that comes in, who's known for his metalworking, specifically with bronze. And some of the furnishing of the temple was elaborate. Again, we talked about the pillars itself with the pomegranates, the lily on the top, and the intricacies of that. And we talked about how that required a skilled craftsman, and the Israelites, at least relative to their neighbors, were not necessarily known to be skilled craftsmen with metal, but that's why Hiram's brought in to deal with that. We talked about some of the not just the furnishings of the temple, but also some of the things that were necessary for the temple. We talked about the big basin, which is where, again, water would be poured in. And based on this illustration, you would obtain water from that in the 10 different smaller basins with wheeled carts on them. And that's how the priests would go through the process of ritually cleansing themselves, so that way that they would be all able to make the sacrifices as they needed to, which again was part of their responsibility as the priests within the temple. And that was another depiction there that we have of the type of wheeled smaller basins that the water would be put into. And obviously you would be able to transport these around the temple as you would need to do so. And I believe we left off in verse 40 of chapter 7. So that's where we're going to pick up. It says in verse 40 that Hiram also made the pots, the shovels, and the basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the top of the pillars, and the 2 lattice works to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars. Again, that's just a summation of those 2 pillars that were built on the north and the south side of the temple as it faced east. 42, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works, 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work to cover the 2 bowls of the capital that were on the pillars. Again, a reference to the tops of those pillars. Verse 43, the 10 stands and the 10 basins on the stands. Reference there to the wheeled carts. And then verse 43, the 1 sea and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. That's a reference there to the great basin where the water would be held. So verses 40 through 43 is just a summation of what we just saw. So verse 45, it says that now the pots, the shovels, and the basins, all these vessels in the house of the Lord, which Hiram made for King Solomon, were of burnished bronze. In the plain of the Jordan, the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. And Solomon left all the vessels unweighed because there were so many of them, the weight of the bronze was not ascertained. So in verse 45, what we have here are what we might call the utensils. Maybe not necessarily for eating, but the utensils needed to carry out the other types of the work of the temple. So the pots, the shovels, the basins. Obviously, you had all this type of equipment that was also necessary to go through the whole, that was necessary for all the other responsibilities of the priest. We might think of it today as like at least in my mind, the way that I think about it, I think about like a cook in a kitchen. He's got all of his utensils that, may have a spatula. He's got some type of, he may have some type of metal plate that specifically goes in the oven. All different types of equipment. That's basically what's being described there in verse 45. And we notice, of course, that all of that is created out of burnished bronze, which, while not being gold, was still a pretty expensive metal. In verse 46, it tells us where this was all done. In the plain of the Jordan, the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. Now, I don't have a map of this, but most archaeologists believe that the cities of Succoth and Zarethan were located due east of Jerusalem, east of the Jordan River, which, for whatever reason, that area was made suitable, maybe perhaps because of the amount of perhaps because of the land. That's why it was made. We notice, though, that verse 47, that all the vessels were left unweighed, and it just goes to show to us how elaborate and how expensive this whole process was to make all of these vessels. It shows certainly Solomon's understanding of, wanting to do his best for the house of God. And we ultimately know later on that for Solomon, this whole process of the number of workers that he hires to carry out the work of the temple is going to lead to some problems when we get to the end of Solomon's reign. So verse 48, so Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north, before the inner sanctuary, the flowers, the lamps, and the tongs of gold. Some of this is what we have up here, right? The golden altar, I know this is not quite it, but this is the best that I could find of the pictures that relate to this. Again, the table of showbread, the golden altar, and then the lampstand, which we know, of course, today, a lot of people that practice Judaism call that a menorah. And then the ark, as we're going to see in chapter 8. So verse 50, the cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, and fire pans of pure gold, and the sockets of gold for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the nave of the temple. And so you've got all these elements. Verse 50, the other aspects of the door, the most holy place, and the entrance of the temple. So verse 51, it just sums up and says, thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. And so by the end of chapter 7, we now have the furnishing of the temple. And that's going to lead us into chapter 8. We're going to try to get down through verse 11 this morning. But what we have in chapter 8 is what we would call perhaps the dedication of the temple. And that will happen because of the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant. So as we turn to chapter 8, it says that Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel before King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the feast in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. So there are a couple of things that I want to point out as we begin this chapter. The 7th month, Ethanim, corresponds to, at least on our calendars from what we understand, somewhere between the middle of September to the middle of October. So we would call this the fall. We would call this, fall for us, but we think of the 7th month, we think of July, we think of the summer, but this more so corresponds to fall or autumn for that time of the year for us. One of the things that we know about the Old Testament and what we know about this time period for the Israelites is that this was a this was a time of celebration, or this month was connected to that. I want you to look in your Bibles for a moment at Leviticus chapter 23. Now, in Leviticus 23, you have a series of listings in terms of the types of feasts and celebrations that the people of Israel were commanded to observe. In Leviticus chapter 23, beginning in verse 26, beginning in verse 23, we see a series of things that the Israelites were supposed to observe in this seventh month, Ethanim. And if you notice Leviticus 23, beginning in verse 23, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, in the seventh month, on the first day of the month, you shall observe a day of solemn rest, a memorial proclaimed with blast of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work, and you shall present a food offering to the Lord." All right, so what we have here is a celebration that takes place. Notice verse 26, that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Now on the 10th day of this seventh month is the day of atonement. It shall be for you a time of holy convocation, and you shall afflict yourselves and present a food offering to the Lord. And you shall not do any work on that very day, for it is a day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. For whoever is not afflicted on that very day shall be cut off from his people, and whoever does any work on that very day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall not do any work. It is a statute forever throughout your generations, in all your dwelling places. It shall be to you a Sabbath, a solemn rest, and you shall afflict yourselves. On the 9th day of the month, beginning at evening, from evening to evening, shall you keep your Sabbath." So the Day of Atonement was also, on the calendar at least for the Israelites, it's also located in this month. And so on that specific day, as we read there, the Israelites are not supposed to do any type of work. Again, this was supposed to be a day in which they offer sacrifice for the sins of the people, a very important day. And we notice in verse 33 that in the seventh month, not only do you have the Day of Atonement, but you also have the Feast of Booths, sometimes also called the Feast of Tabernacles in the New Testament. So verse 33, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of this seventh month, and for 7 days is the Feast of Booths to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord, and on the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work." So the overall point is that this time period on the Israelite calendar was one of the most important months for the Israelites in terms of the feast connected to it, in terms of this also being connected to the Day of Atonement, which was held in this month. A very important month, and this is going to be the same month that Solomon decides to dedicate the temple. Now, if we go back and look, and some have pointed out that perhaps what has happened here is that there's a year between what's happened in chapter 7 and what happens in chapter 8. Because if I'm not mistaken, the temple was finished in the 8th month. And then we read about what's going to happen here in chapter 8 in the 7th month. So a lot of people seem to think that perhaps the temple is built, and then a year later the temple is dedicated, which is where the ark is going to be brought in. And so this is a really big thing for the people of Israel, right? Because God, again, the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God. God's presence is about to be put right back into the temple. which we'll talk about that more in a moment. In verse 3 it says that all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered, which would correspond to this time of the year for the Israelites where they did offer a lot of sacrifices. Verse 6, then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. So that's, you see a lot of different depictions of it. Again, the most common one has the Ark of the Covenant looking something similar to what you have there on the screen. And we know that the Ark of the Covenant was very important to the Israelites. We saw in 1 and 2 Samuel that the understanding of the people was that a lot of times if you brought the Ark of the Covenant out to battle, you had the presence of God with you. That would often lead to victory for the Israelites. Sometimes, of course, that did not work. We remember with Eli, and we remember with Eli's sons, right, Hophni and Phinehas, what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 4 when they brought the ark out to battle. They lost, right, because they were, we saw in 1 Samuel chapter 2, they were very wicked men. They basically corrupted the worship of God to fulfill their own pleasures. And the end result of that is that they died as a result of that battle. We know that Eli, coincidentally, when he heard the news about his sons dying, he likewise fell over and died. And what happened to the ark? Yeah, the ark was what we would say is lost, but the Philistines took it, right? And it goes to the land of the Philistines, and we might remember that, you know, the Ark of the Covenant afflicted the Philistines to the point that they started to move it around throughout the land of Philistia, and, you know, bad things kept happening when they did that, and then they ultimately just handed it right back to the Israelites. So the ark was very important because it symbolized the presence of God, and that's the significance of why they dedicate the temple perhaps now. Because up to this point, you know, God's presence wasn't there in the temple, but that's what's going to essentially happen here in chapter 8. We might also notice that Samuel learned from his father's mistakes. We remember that one of the things that David told, not Samuel, Solomon, we remember one of the things that David told Solomon right before David died was to keep all the commandments and the statutes of God. Well, we know when it came to the Ark of the Covenant, there was one specific commandment that David did not keep. And what was that?
How it was transported.
How it was transported, right? With the ark being transported back in 2 Samuel, David did not take the right measures with the transportation of the ark. And so what happened in that scenario?
The oxen were driving along, and the other thought it was going to fall off, so he touched it, and of course he died.
Yeah, so they don't carry it, right? They don't carry it by the poles. It's put on a cart. The oxen are driving the cart. The cart starts to tumble over. Uzzah goes to touch the ark. Uzzah dies as a result of it. And we know the reason why that happened is because David did not keep that specific commandment of God in terms of how the ark was supposed to be carried. So one of the things that we notice here about Solomon that maybe we don't think about, because it's not specifically stated right in front of our face, but we do have the understanding here that Solomon at least learned from his father's mistakes when it came to how the ark was to be carried, because we notice, of course, that the ark was being carried by the poles. And this is another depiction of it, perhaps, that's connected to the dedication of the dedication of the temple. But again, you notice that it was the responsibility of the Levites who had to carry the ark by the poles, not to put it on a cart and let the oxen drive it. And that was what God expected of how it was to be transported, and that's exactly what happened. And so things turn out well. Things turn out well for the Israelites in this situation. No one dies as a result of the improper transportation of it. So verse 8, the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. So, in other words, the poles themselves, at least when they sat down, you could see that if you were standing inside the holy place, which is where the table of showbread and the lampstand and the altar of incense were located. And that just reemphasizes that the Israelites did exactly as what they should have when they carried the ark. And notice that it says they are there to this day. Now verse 9 gives us an interesting statement that there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. Now, why is that an interesting statement there in verse 9?
The pot of manna was in there before, and Aaron's rod.
Right, we remember that when the Ark of the Covenant was made, 3 things were put in the ark. One of which is still there, right? The 2 tablets, the 2 tablets of stone that Moses broke. The pot of manna, which is not there. And what else? Aaron's rod that budded. I think that was back in the book of Numbers. Those 3 things were placed in the Ark of the Covenant. But in verse 9, we're only told that the only thing left in the ark was the 2 tablets of stone. So my question is, what happened to the other 2 items? Well, I'll tell you, I don't know. That's the simplest answer that I have to that. I do not know. Some people may theorize that wood obviously decays and rots over time. Same thing can happen to bread as well. Bread is something that is perishable. We know that wood can be easily destroyed. Maybe that's what happened. Obviously, we don't know. We know, of course, if we remember back in, I think it was 1 Samuel chapter 6, there was an individual, and I can't remember his name, but correct me if I'm wrong, but they wanted to open the Ark of the Covenant. And I think that man died as a result of it. But in terms of what happened to the elements inside that, we don't really know. I think about opening the Ark of the Covenant, you probably think about the same thing that I do, the Indiana Jones movie, right? The Raiders of the Lost Ark. I remember I saw that as a kid, and that horrified me. When they opened up the Ark of the Covenant, and that, the guy's face just kind of melted away. But, visually in my mind, that's what I think about when I think about a passage like this, is what happened when they opened the Ark. Whatever the reason, those 2 elements were not there anymore. Or those 2 contents were not there anymore. But that's not really what mattered. What matters in this entire scenario is that this represents God being put in his rightful place. Verse 10 says that when the priest came out of the holy place, that a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Now, I want to go back in our Old Testaments to the book of Exodus for a moment, because we have a similar description given connected to the ark in that passage. So turn to Exodus chapter 40, and let's look at verses 34 and 35. This is a reference now to the ark this is a reference to the tabernacle and the same concept of God's presence being there in the tabernacle. Verse 34 says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting." and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Notice verse 36, that throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. And we know that we know the importance of that because, again, God directed the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. And we know, of course, that the Israelites wind up wandering in the wilderness because of their lack of faith in God, by not believing Joshua and Caleb and their confidence in God. But the presence of God was noted there in the cloud settling on it. When the cloud moved, then the people of Israel would take up their tents and they would move wherever the cloud would lead them. God leading them to Canaan being the idea. However, now in 1 Kings chapter 8, the similar cloud that led the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, that cloud in the minds of the Israelites will now settle permanently there in the temple because the temple is a permanent structure. And God's presence it was understood that God's presence was there in the temple and that things were fine for Israel because the cloud that filled the house of the Lord remained there. And much like Moses, the priests there could not stand to minister. They couldn't do their job because of the glory of God filling the house of the Lord. That concept plays a lot of significance when we get to the New Testament and we think about the death of Christ. Where the veil of the temple was torn, it represented again God's presence leaving the temple, and what we know to be the fact that we're moving from Judaism to Christianity in terms of, what does God expect out of His followers? Not to follow the law of Moses, but to follow the law of Christ when Christ was crucified and the church would be established. The presence of God left the temple in that sense in the New Testament. Whereas we know in the Old Testament the presence of God will eventually leave because of the Israelites' own wickedness, which led to their captivity. Now, one thing that I'll point out here about at least a point of application, because there are a lot of details here, but in my mind something that stands out about this passage is the willingness, the dedication, and the attention to detail that these Israelites had in terms of putting God in His rightful place. You think about the fact that all the men of Israel came to this occasion. All the men of Israel. Now, while this is an important month, a month that they had to observe the Day of Atonement and those feasts, this is a separate event connected to it, and yet all these men are there to see God be put in His rightful place. You think about the attention to detail in terms of God being brought, right, or the ark being brought. There were no chances to replicate the same mistakes of David. Solomon was not going to do that. He wanted everything to be done the way that it was supposed to, with the men carrying the ark on the poles. And we know, of course, that the priests were already there willing to carry out their service to God when the ark was being put in the most holy place, because the priests were there ready to do their job. And when you think about that concept, you think about how all these individuals, whether it's the men of Israel, whether it's Solomon in his commands, whether it's the priests that are there to carry out their duties, they're all there because they understand that they have a role in making sure that God is put in His rightful place throughout all Israel. Now, sometimes we know that when we say put somebody in their place, we think about it in a negative way. But in this particular case, we think about it in a positive way. The men of Israel, all these gathered here, they are very adamant to God that we want you to be in your rightful place among us as the people of Israel. When we, as Christians, it's something that we can think about in this passage about the dedication that we need to take in our lives to make sure that we are putting God in the right place. We do that through our service. If we're ready to serve, to help out with the church, right? We're putting God in His place, much like the priests were there ready to serve when God was, when God's presence was there in the temple. You think about the dedication to follow what the Bible says and what it teaches and how we carry out our actions as Christians. That reflects Solomon's desire to do everything as God would want him to do in order to let the people of Israel know that God is being put in His rightful place. We have to do that as well as Christians. Before we go, are there any final thoughts or comments on what we've talked about up to this point?
I think how awe-inspiring this must have been for them to see the ark, to carry the ark, to see the temple and the beauty of the temple and know that the cloud was there, God was there. Then I think we serve the same God today they did then, and He's just as much with us now as He was with them then. Though we may not see a cloud, we know that He is here, and our worship should be awe-inspiring as well because of who God is and what He does for us.
Right. That's another good point. This passage should help give us maybe a proper perspective on, at least internally, why are we here? Why are we here to worship? It's because we are trying to make sure that we are acknowledging that we want to put God in His rightful place in our lives, which is what the people of Israel were doing here. We'll speak more to that next week when we get to verse 12. But thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning.